Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another installment of the Crossroads of comic book and history. This is Billboard Comics' way of showing you how the real world intersected in quite interesting ways with the comic book world. And today, our headliner is Prince. Yes, Prince. If you're going to think I'm going to talk about the Prince comic book that he had for Milestone back in the 90s, no, I'm not going to talk about that. Maybe some other time, but not now. I'm going to talk about how he kicked off a new brand of Puritanism that affected not just the world of music, but also the world of video games, and more specifically, the world of comic books. Now, I'm sure all of you people out there who used to remember physical media remember, notice, or recognize the little black and white rectangular placard that you might find on some of your books that says warning explicit lyrics. That wasn't always there. And the reason why it was on there is because of Prince. More specifically, his album Purple Rain. More specifically, the fifth song on the first side. Yes, back in the old days, you got nothing but LPs and or cassettes, and they're divided into sides, so you had to flip the thing over to get the full album experience. Brief history lesson on the physical media of music, but nonetheless, Song 5, Side 1, Darling Nikki. Now, Purple Rain was one of the most biggest of Prince's albums. It tied into a movie of the same name that was very well received. It contains hints, say like "Let's Go Crazy," "Purple Rain," "When Doves Cry." You've probably heard them at least once in your life, even if you're not a Prince fan. It should have entered into your listening habit, even if you're walking through a supermarket or a mall or in somebody else's car or whatever. It's a big album for really, really big songs. Darling Nikki was not one of those songs. It was like one of the album cuts that wasn't released. The reason why it's probably not released because it is quite sexually explicit. It deals. I'm not going to go into it, but nonetheless, it's not exactly what you might call kid friendly. Now, anybody who knew music back in the day, even me, I believe I was like maybe 13, 14 at the time, I knew that, even at that time, at my young age, that Prince could get a little raunchy every so often once you get past the hits. Heck, even his hit Little Red Corvette, I mean, that is loaded with subtext that is totally sexual. You know, jockeys, Trojans, get it together. But I digress. One of the people who didn't really understand exactly how dirty Prince could be in his music was Tipper Gore. Tipper Gore was, at the time, I believe they're not longer married, but she was the wife of Al Gore, who was a congressman from Tennessee. He's the same guy who would go on to become vice president and also be the creative force behind An Inconvenient Truth about global warming and all that jazz. But back then, she was kind of like walking through, I guess, her house, her stately manor, and came across her 11-year-old daughter listening to Darling Nikki. And she came across herself like listen to it closely. I'm like, she was able to finally realize what Prince is talking about. Well, she wasn't going to stand for that. She came into action and decided to create the Parents Media Research Council, the PMRC. And their job, more than anything else, is to make sure that evil lyrics, such as the kind you find in Darling Nikki and a whole bunch of other ones, would never, ever, ever find their way to the unsuspecting ears of little kids. Now, if you're like me, you're probably think like, well, isn't this the parent's job? I mean, I'm a parent, and I know how hard it is to be like that, but at least I kind of try to get an idea of it. It's not back in the 80s. Back in the 80s, kids were threatened by everything. And I think it came from like a change. There was a change when I was a younger kid where I could go out and a lot of people of Generation X will say this to you: go out in the morning during the summer. Don't come back until the streetlights come out. And the parents didn't give one care about that. But then, all of a sudden, a rash of child abductions started to happen, and the Atlanta child killings happened. and a whole bunch of stuff about like where kids were threatened and in danger, and then all of a sudden, kind of like to backpedal of like all these years I gave them complete and utter freedom. I'm going to have to micromanage everything that the kids do, but they don't really want to micromanage it. They want somebody else to do it for them. This is a little bit of editorialization, so I apologize for that. This is a touchy subject for me, but hopefully you go along with me. And if you have a opposing opinion, you want to get an intelligent discussion, I'll try to be as intelligent as possible. Do some in the comments. And but if you're going to yell at me and say I'm an idiot, don't bother. I will not even respond or acknowledge it. But I digress. But a parent being upset by what the kid is listening to would probably be happening across the country 10,000 times a day during when this happened. Tipper Gore was a little bit different because she was a political wife and she could have stuff done. So she decided to actually try to get together a kind of like an organization to kind of police this kind of stuff. They were trying to get at least a kind of like a label on the albums that have explicit lyrics, or have the lyrics printed onto the actual record so the parents could actually understand what was going on. Not only feasible as the CDs were replacing vinyl albums, and you went from having this much space to this much space, but that happened. They're also like trying to actually have like draw back on like racy record covers that they might think might be objectionable and not have them displayed out in public. If you want to have them sold, we're not going to stop you from selling them, they would say. You just put it behind the front counter underneath this thing where nobody could see it and nobody could know it's out and nobody knows it exists. Well, forget about it then. And kids can't pick it up because why should I watch my kids? But I digress. And I also went so far as saying like that perhaps maybe the recording studios could possibly rethink their contracts with these objectionable recording artists. Like maybe you shouldn't like distribute their albums anymore when their contract ends up. Wouldn't that be a great idea? I mean, I think Prince was at Warner Bros. At the time, and he eventually left there. But I think it's mainly on his own aspect because he didn't like the business dealings he was doing with the company. It wasn't like Warner Bros. Says, "Ew, get away from me," because Prince was one of the biggest rock and roll selling acts in the 1980s. But nonetheless, this kind of like went through a whole bunch of stuff, a whole bunch of controversy. And in August of 1985, the RIAA, the Recording Industry Associates of America, agreed to put those labels that we talked about in the beginning, on their actual albums to let people know, hey, this is a racy kind of stuff. I don't know if this is not good enough for her, or they want Tipper Gore to mind going into more. They eventually, or probably was out in the work when the thing came in and they couldn't stop it, they decided to have a Senate subcommittee meeting on the whole things about how, music is corrupting our youth and turning them into horrible things. I'm going to go into the whole comic book connection a little bit later on, but it's kind of very reminiscent of the Comic Code Authority coming into being. There's a lot of history of people making a big stake about how kids are being affected by certain part of media, and the media deciding to go amongst themselves to try to control the damage by monitoring themselves before they could have anybody else from the outside coming in here and monitoring us. This is exactly what this was. This is what RIAA did. By putting this whole stuff in there, it was able to stave off the whole watchful eye of the government. It didn't stop them doing the subcommittee from before. It didn't really stop them from buying albums because, I remember growing up in this time and you knew it was a really good album if it had that little label on it. And you tried to buy it either when your parents weren't around and keep it from them, or, if you're an adult, then you'd buy it then. But I digress. But it had a big subcommittee meeting and about people fighting about it's free speech versus protecting our kids and stuff like this. And on the side of free speech was a motley trio of recording artists. If you had this is back before you had the Lollapaloozas and big like festivals where you have 20 artists, 30 hours to fill the bill, and you have to have people from like blues with country, with rock, hard rock, and heavy metal and all stuff like this. Usually, the peanut butter didn't mix with the jelly back in those days, except for here, because the three main people who fought for this was Frank Zappa, Dee Snider from Twisted Sister, and John Denver. John Denver was the "You fill up my senses, thank God I'm a country boy," one of the least offensive rock artists ever, or country artist, or whatever you want to categorize him. According to like my research on here, people actually thought he was going to talk in support of the PMRC, but he did like a last minute heel turn and decided to hit Tipper Gore over the back with a sealed chair. Not really metaphorically. He spoke out for the creative freedom of the artists. Thankfully, this subcommittee didn't really go any further than the actual label on there and stuff like this, and people were able to actually, like I said, make more money because now people knew exactly what the dirty albums were without having to actually go through, word of mouth. Oh, you gotta see them. Yeah, some of the songs on the new Prince album are really, some are really, 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 really kind of racy. This would go again in the 90s with video games, and this is why you have the video games little square thing on there that says E for everyone. That's why, because there are games like Mortal Kombat and other ones that are even worse than that upped gore, violence, and sexuality that, once again, was turning our kids into deviants. What does this have to do with comic books? Well, around the same time this happened, about a year later, actually in 1986, actually November 18th, 1986, two police officers went into a comic book store called Friendly Frank's in Lansing, Illinois. And they bought a number of comic books, about 15 comic books, off the manager, Michael Correa. These were adults, and they were buying adult comic books that they were put aside and away from public view by the manager. So everybody in there was an adult, and it wasn't been sold to a kid, it wasn't sold for given to a kid or whatever like that. Everybody here was adults. And Michael Correa didn't think anything about that. He sold it and thought, okay, enjoy your weirdo or your Omaha the Cat dancer. If that's your kink, go right ahead. Until about a month later, 6 armed police officers raided the very same comic book store. They confiscated a whole bunch of other books and arrested Correa for so they arrested Correa, and it's spelled Correa. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. It might be different, but I apologize if it isn't. And with the whole main thing about the whole thing about this is going to be affecting the kids, the children. Like I said 5 seconds ago, these were sold from an adult to an adult, and kids never entered into the kind of equation on it. But they're worried about the kids, not just like in with the music, the kids, the sexuality, and devil music and devil coming into it, and they were so worried about kids being influenced by pop culture that it was a big thing. The part in Stranger Things where people think that people were doing Dungeons and Dragons were devil worshippers, that was a real thing. That happened. There's actually a TV movie starring Tom Hanks that kind of very hilariously covered that. But this was like a way of kind of doing this. Like one of the arresting officers, and this is on the Wikipedia page, so you could check it out where it is. I think the actual article it was in is under a paywall, so I couldn't read all of it. But the guy said, basically, he said that he could look around the store and see a whole bunch of satanic influence in the store, and just 3/4 of the rock and roll music of the day. He's not wrong, because this is probably the time when Faust was around and Son of Satan was published 10 years beforehand. If you wanted to look for Satanism in comic books during that time, you had a lot of places that you could find it. But I digress. This was kind of a way of basically the man coming in and protecting kids from people who are using a kids-only kind of like kind of media against them. I mean, comic books are for kids, right? They're for kids. They're for kids. They're selling porn to kids. Now let's go over here. I'm going to go over like a little bit like this, like of the books that they confiscated on the second time around. Just go that. Like the aforementioned Omaha and Weirdo, Heavy Metal, which does a lot of adult content in it. It's the kind of European stories who are kind of a little more liberated with their adult stuff, granted. But they added Elektra Assassin, which, published by Marvel, was still a little controversial at the time. Love and Rockets. Love and Rockets was one of the most well-regarded books to come out in the 1980s, both on an artistic level and a creative level. Yes, it dealt with Frank's sexual nature. It did deal with like love, nudity, and stuff like that. But it was telling, in the process of telling a story of this microcosm of human beings. I this is one of the things that I haven't read a lot of, but what I've read I've absolutely loved. And this is like my golden age retirement kind of thing. I'm going to sit down and read all the books that they put out and try to get into it and try to catch up and do stuff like this. It is a high quality, fine book. It's if you think of pornography as being just nothing but sex, it's not that. It has a story. Even Omaha, which is much more sexual than Love and Rockets, had a story, had a storyline about these people living in this area and had like mystery and intrigue and stuff like this. There's more than that than just like having people having sex. But I regret. But also in there was like Miss Tree was also included in this group of 15. I just completed a set of it. I wanted to when I was a kid because, again, like I said, when I was a kid, sometimes it just scared me off a little bit. But now I'm an adult, I could do whatever. I haven't really seen anything in it so far that leads me to believe that it is bad pornography. But I know there's like several things about violence and also I guess maybe nudity in it. I don't know. Like I said, I haven't read all of it. And also ElfQuest. ElfQuest is also a massively important part of comic book history. Not only just the fact that it was like one of the first creator-owned books that actually succeeded and is still going to this day, but also the narrative technique and opening up the comic books to other like genres and stuff like this. It's very important. And yes, it involves elves, which I guess most of those things are like the Keebler elves and stuff like this. And oh yeah, kids are gonna love that. Engaging like as normal human beings with violence and sex and language and stuff like this. It's an adult book, aimed for adults, intended for adults. And this is the big thing about this whole thing, this time of comic book history, which is kind of shameful. The comic books were facing a battle between. They have been maturing. The kids who were actually kids who took their bike to the drugstore and paid 10, 12 cents for the latest issue of Action Comics and read Superman until it fell apart and handed on to the next guy. They grew up to become comic book creators. But they weren't just influenced by comic books. They were influenced by true literature and movies and TVs and stuff that raised their tastes and their things up to more of an adult level. They weren't trying to write pablum for kids. They're trying to write stuff they want to read as adults, marketed to other adults. But the public perception was, bam, pam, boom, bang. Comic books, they aren't for kids anymore. And this is why you had grades like this, because if people are actually more open as they are today, the fact that comic books are for a wide range of ages and maturity levels, we wouldn't have these rates here. Now, as you can understand, even back in the 80s, this was kind of a big deal. My career was just a manager at the place. He didn't own the place. The owner of the place was a Frank Magliarania. I don't know if he's still with us, but like that. He owns a chain of them. I think they're all over the Chicagoland area. But he was targeted as that, and they want to make him an example of this. They're going to do this. If he wanted to, he could have gone out with a $250 fine, and have to go through probation and always be kind of like, but always have like this kind of like him selling dirty stuff to kids on his record, or he could fight it, which would cost thousands upon thousands upon thousands of dollars. And he decided to fight it, and obviously he couldn't do it on his own. Frank Maglinara decided to actually start fundraising efforts, trying to get in touch with somebody. Dennis Kitchen, who was the founder and owner of Kitchen Sink Comics, whose comics were part of the raid and got Korea in trouble, was involved in it. It became benefit stuff. There was they had a signed. They originated a signing with Neil Gaiman. Back then, he wasn't as toxic as he is now. But with Neil Gaiman to earn money for Korea's defense. There's also a portfolio where artists ranging from legends like Will Eisner, Frank Miller, and Sergio Aragonés, all the way down to Robert Crumb, put together a portfolio sold with all the proceeds going to this. Kitchen was responsible with collecting the money, and he put it all into one separate bank account that could not be touched by anything, and he kind of jokingly named this fund the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. If you have been to a comic book convention recently, you probably have seen a booth from the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. Now, 40 years later, it's still around, protecting the rights of comic book creators from censorship, unfair or not, and trying to keep stuff like this from happening ever again. It has happened again over the past, but they're there to actually provide legal compensation, provide real good lawyers so they could fight this instead of having to settle for whatever lawyer they could afford. And this is where the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund got its start, during these raids back in the 80s. And it turned out good. The first time around, when he didn't really have the whole Comic Book Legal Defense Fund money behind him, he lost the case. He was found guilty. He was fined $750 and sentenced to 1 year of court supervision, because the court had to keep an eye on him because he's that dangerous. And I'm sure the people in the court were thinking and the cops were good, I'll show you right. There, you sell stuff to kids. How dare you? You've got over $250, now you got $750. Now go away. And now we're going to make sure that nobody sells this kind of filth to people who are adults and want to read it because they're adults. There's such a thing about calling appeals. And the appeals is when the Comic Book Legal Defense came in, a much better lawyer came in, and, Korea won his appeal. The guilty verdict was overturned. It was finally officially overturned in 11/16/1989. That's about 5 years after the whole thing started, and almost 2 years after he was found guilty the first time. So this is basically the whole thing about this is set an example. This is how you're doing. You're going to have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to defend yourself against these charges, to do this. And you could either just not sell the stuff to adults who might want it, even though you're taking efforts to make sure it doesn't get in the hands of kids, or we'll make it as punitive to you as possible. The Comic Book Legal Defense Fund came in and said, no, this is not constitutional. We support this. Got the case overturned, and he didn't have to pay any fine whatsoever, and didn't have any court supervision. So that's how the whole new Puritanism of the 80s kind of not only caught up in the whole PMRC thing, also captured a whole bunch of comic book stuff in it as well. I remember growing up at that time and being I think early teenager at that time, and it was eye opening and shocking. I was not like I said, I'm buying a lot of these stuff now that I didn't buy then because it was too adult for me, because I respected my parents, because my parents were for all their faults or benefits, they were seeing what I was buying, so they knew exactly what I could get, and what I was allowed to get was too mature for me. They wouldn't let me have it. Not a lot of people in the 80s were doing that. It's kind of the home and latchkey kids, wet it, wipe it tonight, good night, and last thing I have to do about is that. this could very well have destroyed the comic book industry, or at least halt the advancement and the growth of it. We could very well not have had Watchmen. We would not have Swamp Thing. We would probably not have like Batman Damned, but that's not that. But anything like Blankets, Fun Home, any of the really big, challenging kind of like comic books that have made an impact on it. Mouse and Persepolis. There's two other things there. Would probably not be around if, say, this didn't start the comic book legal defense fund, and they didn't fight back the way they could. There are still ratings on comic books. I know that. I get that. There's sometimes like T, M. I know that. But it's better than having like people being arrested for selling Love and Rockets to an adult who might actually appreciate it and not be an undercover cop. What do you think about this? What is your opinions on this? Do you think like the police were right in this? Do you think like I don't mean to sound like, do you think they're really? I mean, do you think like the police were right in this? Do you think there's a point to be made about how you should monitor this thing? About that. I mean, I try to make the point that Friendly Franks was monitoring the access of children to this information, but do you think that the state was right in pursuing this and Lincoln was? Have you given to the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund? They are not exactly the most scandal-free organization. Let me put that delicately. They do serve a purpose, though, however, and it's kind of like, you have to make the moral judgment, hold your nose, and perhaps maybe support it when you really don't want to. But are you a supporter of them? Are you saying, like, why did you say that? They've gone so much further from those scandals they had. How dare you? Let me know in the comments. And if you like this, please hit the like button. And if you want to subscribe, I do this segment about the Crossroads of history and comic books every Thursday. And if you want to hear anything like you think might be interesting, like why did this come out during this time? Like, is there a connection there? I will research it and try to do something for you like this, if you'd like to. I would love to do that. So, please subscribe, comment, and like it, and that helps me so much, and I would really appreciate it. All right. That being said, I hope you have a good day. Read whatever you want that's appropriate for your age range, because you're an adult and you could do whatever you want. And if I could tell you something, I shouldn't tell you anything because it may be against your rights. Keep on collecting.